Social behavior. Basic questions we're going to be looking at in this lecture. What is social psychology? What is Levine's interactionist perspective? How do we explain others and our own behavior? All right, so social psychology. I want to get back the paper airplane demonstration or activity that we did early on in this class. And again, we tried to explain why Professor Mangan can make such accurate predictions about human behavior. Why do people go along with the direct requests of a so-called authority figure? That's me. That's kind of the behavior that was elicited by the activity. So we explain that in terms of a interaction of disposition. That's what students bring to the situation, and the situation is just that. It's the environment, sort of the requirements of the antecedent conditions, the rules, the norms, and expectations of particular situations interact in complex ways with the traits and attributes and so forth of individuals to at best increase the likelihood of a particular behavior. So if we wanted to explain behavior, any behavior, think of it as this complex, the end result of a complex interaction between disposition and situation. So in the last module, we looked at disposition. That is, personality psychology looks at traits and attributes and so forth. Those aspects of ourselves that are internal, presumably, at least to some extent from some perspectives, and that are rather consistent across time and across place. Whereas the social psychologist is interested primarily in the power of the situation. So social psychology concerns how the real or imagined presence of others influences how we think, feel, and behave. And imagined is in there because just because we're alone, we don't radically change our behavior. I mean, some people might, but still we have internalized certain norms and rules and expectations throughout our socialization. From the time we're young to the time we're adults and so forth. And so we don't just jettison all those types of behaviors that we've acquired in social settings just because we're alone. So just imagining the presence of others can influence how we think, feel, and behave. So that's in there too. So different topics that social psychologists are interested in, really covers a lot of ground. I teach a social psychology class, and I actually begin the class with a brief history of the subdiscipline and the methods that are used in social psychological research. That's how I begin it. But then the first really topic, the content area, is the social self, and really what that content concerns is the very our very sense of self, our self-concept, that constellation of beliefs that we have about ourselves is, at least to a good extent, a large extent, social in origin. We learn about ourselves by observing how others react to us and actually imagining how others are thinking about us. So really there's this looking glass self that we learn about ourselves. We learn to think and feel and act towards ourselves in a particular way in a social context. So really the power of others, those social contexts, particularly early on and certainly later on in life, are very important in the formation of the beliefs and feelings that we have about ourselves. And then there's just a whole host of other topics. Social perception, that is, we're constantly in the business of processing social information. We perceive other people and we form impressions of those individuals as they do of us. Social influence, how we exert and accept social influence. Group dynamics, how do people make decisions, for example, in groups versus when they're alone or as individuals. Prejudice, discrimination, aggression, attraction, helping behavior, pro-social behavior, anti-social behavior, asocial behavior, and there's just so many topics of interest to social psychologists. So really, the social psychologist is really captivated by the power of the situation, and sometimes situations can be completely overwhelming, and we find ourselves doing things that we never believed ourselves to be capable of doing as a result of the situations that we find ourselves in. So sometimes the power of the situation can be so strong it could completely eclipse and overwhelm everything that we believe to be true about ourselves, and we can surprise even ourselves in particular situations. So a very brief history here. So in 1930 to 1950 or so, social psychology really was put on the map, and it's a strange attribution, but Adolf Hitler is primarily responsible, and that's because of what was going on in Nazi Germany in the 30s and certainly into the 40s, as the Allies invaded, and it was revealed to the world what the Nazis had done. The Holocaust, the systematic extermination of millions and millions of people, it sort of flew in the face of reasonable people like you and me. It's like, how could people in one of the most advanced, that is industrially, intellectually, artistically advanced countries of the Western world, how could this have happened? Was it something about the German people? Was it something about um, some trait or attribute that they had acquired through their particular socialization period? What was going on? How can you get ordinary people to do the awful things that happened under the National Socialist Party? And so this led to studies in propaganda, persuasion, prejudice and discrimination. It led to studies in autocratic governmental systems versus more laissez-faire democratic governmental systems. So it led to a lot of research that was of social was by in nature social psychological. Kurt Lewin is credited with being the father of modern social psychology. He was one of the guys that got out before Hitler really kind of his regime really took off. So he fled like a lot of Jews did. He was able to get out, and he settled in the United States. He came up with this interactionist perspective, and we've seen this before. It looks sort of quasi-mathematical, but really it's just that that notion that if we're trying to explain behavior, we can think of it as a function of the person-environment interaction. So you land a person with their own particular dispositions and predispositions in a particular environment, and that environment has its own antecedent conditions, rules and norms, and so forth. And you put those two together, and they're going to interact. They're going to bump up against each other in complex ways to create the likelihood of something happening, some event, some behavioral event, some cognitive event, some emotional event. And this is the interactionist perspective. So if you forget everything that you've learned in this class, just remember that behavior is really, most behavior is the end product of this complex person-environment interaction. So we can credit Lewin with that. But he did a lot of early experimentation in social psychology, so that's why he's considered to be the father of modern social psychology. He took social behavior and put it into the laboratory, put it under the microscope of science in the lab. So again, this interactionist perspective really reflects, I guess, interdisciplinary, the necessity of interdisciplinary work to really understand why people think, feel, and act the way they do. This important intersection between personality and social psychology, which are two big areas in this rather vast and diversified discipline of psychology. All right, so that's a very brief history. So what I'd like you to do now is you're going to pause this and you're going to watch the video of bullying the bus monitor. And this was kind of an awful event that made it into the national press, and this is a couple years ago. But as you watch this, and you don't have to watch the whole thing, just watch it until you get enough of an idea about what's going on there. Essentially, it's just a bunch of boys bullying a bus monitor. And what I'd like you to do is explain the boys' behavior using that behavior as a function of the person-environment interaction. So this will be a cursory explanation of what you observe going on in that bus. So pause this, watch that, and then come on back. All right, so presumingly I presume that you watched the video. And when I first watched this video, when this made it into the national press and it was on the news, and I've got to tell you that my first reaction was anger. I witnessed bullying when I was a kid on the bus. I went to kind of to school in a rough area, and it was just ongoing torture in some cases. And so I have a personal experience with this, and it really made me angry. And my first reaction was, oh, those little guys, if I could get my hands on them, and I hope they get theirs in the end. And then thereafter, I, after some time passed, I began to consider, I'm a psychologist, I have a certain responsibility to contextualize behavior because I know it's complex. I know that we can't simply explain somebody's behavior in terms of one thing or the other. It's never that simple. So then I began thinking about the social context in which the behavior was occurring. So I started thinking about the situation. So my first reaction, as I think was the primary reaction of many, and this is why this sort of thing gets play in the media, because it evokes a strong emotional response, and that's what the media wants, right? Because it captures eyeballs, so then people stay tuned and they have to watch the advertisements, right? So, but I just wanted to identify the kind of the chain of thinking for myself. First, I made a personal attribution that it was something about those boys or evil little guys and heartless, cruel, sadistic little fellows, and then I sort of backed off and I considered maybe it was something going on in the environment there in the bus, maybe something going on at home, and so forth. So what we're talking about here, and I've chosen to focus on attribution out of all the topics that I could have chosen from this chapter, and there's a lot of them. I'm choosing to focus on attribution because really it's pretty important. It has to do with how we explain other people's behavior, and this is important for a number of reasons, which we'll talk about in a bit. But we're in the business. We're amateur psychologists and amateur detectives. We watch other people. We form impressions. We try to explain why they do what they do. And really, that's what attribution theory is all about. So we're observing, we're explaining other people's behavior, hatching hypotheses, and so forth. And they're doing the same thing when they observe our behavior. So think of an attribution as an inference that we make about the cause of another's behavior. This is important because what we determine to be the cause of another's behavior is going to influence how we think, feel, and act towards that person. So there's two basic flavors of attributions. There's internal attributions and external attributions. When we make an internal attribution, we determine that it's something about the person. It's a dispositional trait or attribute that we use to explain their actions. When we make an external attribution, we attribute their actions largely to the environment. It's something about the situation. So those are two basic explanations when we view another person's actions. It's something about them. It's something about the situation. So I want to point out an interesting study that illustrates a bias that we have. And the bias is probably the bias that a lot of people experience when they watch that Bullying the Bus Monitor video. Rather, we make the determination about the cause of the boy's behavior as being something dispositional. There's something evil about those kids. It's a trait, it's an attribute that they possess that is causing them to act the way that they're acting. And so we have the bias of making internal attributions initially. So there were some interesting initial studies that identified this bias, and we'll name the bias in a minute. But I wanted to talk about one of these studies, and it's the quiz game study. It was a rather clever study. So the setup was a simulation of a game like Jeopardy, one of these quiz game shows, and there were three groups of subjects that were or participants that were randomly assigned to one of three roles. So you had the role of the questioners. These were the Alex Trebek types, the ones that that formulated the questions based on an area of expertise that they have, and they were the ones that were going to be asking the questions. The contestants were the ones that were answering the questions, and the observers were the audience members. So it was like a Jeopardy game setup. And everybody knew what was what. Everybody knew it was a study. Everybody knew that the questioners were going to be asking questions that they had developed themselves that were going to be difficult to ask, and the contest, everybody knew what their role was, right? So the procedures was that the game was played, and everybody played their roles. The questioners asked the questions, the contestants answered the questions, and the observers watched everything going on. And then the participants, that is the observers and the questioners, rated the general knowledge of the questioner and the contestant. So here are the results. So in the observers, they were asked what were their impressions of the questioners and the contestants, the ones that were answering the questions, in terms of their general knowledge compared to an average student. So the observers rated both the questioner and the contestant. You can see that the questioners were perceived as more knowledgeable than the ones that were answering the questions. And by the way, the questioners weren't getting the answers correct, and it was basically a rigged game, because how is a questioner supposed to ask or answer correctly questions that they quite probably don't know anything about? And then the contestants rated their own knowledge against that of an average student. So the questioners, or excuse me, the people that were answering the questions, rated themselves as less intelligent than the average student, and you can see that the questioner was rated by the contestants as being more knowledgeable. So these two green bars against the purple bars is really what we should focus on, because the question becomes, if everybody knew that this was a study, everybody knew that people were randomly assigned to conditions, everybody knew that the questioners were told to develop difficult to answer questions, if everybody knew what was going on, then why do we see this difference? Why are the questioners being reliably, significantly being rated more knowledgeable than the people that are answering the questions? And this is a conundrum, because if everybody knows what's going on, then you would think that the observers and the people, the contestants, would say, okay, I know that this is a rigged game. I know that that person, simply because they're asking the questions, isn't more knowledgeable than I am. It's just that, we're playing these roles and the game is rigged, and so it should be around the same. But yet people, the observers and the contestants, actually made this mistake. This is an example of us sort of confusing sort of the attributes, or explain a person's behavior. Why couldn't these questioners answer the questions correctly? Well, because they just maybe are kind of less knowledgeable or less intelligent than the one that's asking the questions. So this is, it amounts to us, and this is an example, it amounts to us confusing the actor with the role that they're playing. And some people do this, right? You see a movie, you see an actor playing a role, and you become convinced that the actor in real life is like the person in the role that they're playing, and we conflate the two. Whereas actors are doing what they do, they act like somebody else, but we sort of lose our sense of that, and we attribute traits and attributes to individuals, actors, and questioners, and so forth, and that they don't actually have. So why weren't the people answering the questions rated as being as knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than the people asking the questions? Is because they were getting the questions wrong. So this is why it was something about them that caused them to answer most of the questions incorrectly. That is, they're less knowledgeable, which is a mistake. It's a mistake because the game is rigged. Anyway, this is an effect known as the fundamental attribution bias, or when it occurs, it's known as the fundamental attribution error. And we're all prone to make this fundamental attribution error. That is, if we're in the business of making attributions, explaining why people do what they do, We commit the fundamental attribution error when we attribute another's behavior to internal causes while overlooking possible or even probable external causes, right? So when we consider the bullying behavior of those boys on the bus, how do we explain their behavior? Well, at least initially, we say it's something about them. They're evil. When we look at the actions of the individuals that were instrumental in Hitler's final solution, we make the attribution that they're evil people because no ordinary people, no ordinary person like you and me would do that sort of thing. So when we do that, we're overlooking possible or even probable external or situational causes that might support that kind of activity. In fact, sometimes, like I said before, the situation can overwhelm everything that we believe to be true about ourselves. That is, our in areas where we can see that there's a clear right thing to do and clear wrong thing to do. There are situations where we may find ourselves doing what we see in hindsight is really the wrong thing. So overlooking those external or situational things, factors, is really part and parcel of the fundamental attribution, and it's really a mistake to overlook those possible environmental or situational factors. It's a mistake because if you believe that that interactionist perspective is a good explanation, cursory explanation of behavior, you're overlooking an important term in that equation. It's not always something about the person. It's something about the person, situation, interaction. All right, so in the image below, the driver of this car has made a blank that is an internal or external attribution to explain another's behavior. So this is one of my pet peeves, that is people driving slow in the fast lane. How do you explain that? How do you explain that behavior? So this person is holding up and said, get out of the fast lane, moron. So they're making an internal attribution, right? The person is an idiot. They haven't grasped the concept of the fast lane, right? So next time you get behind somebody going slow in the fast lane, notice the attributions that you make. How do you explain that person's behavior? Well, probably you're making an internal attribution if you conclude that they're an idiot. Could be that there's something going on for them, something about their situation that would also serve as a perfectly adequate explanation. You think of one possible alternative explanation for why a person might drive slow in the fast lane. So could be that maybe they got some bad news, maybe they're distracted, maybe they're nervous or something like that, right? They suffer from anxiety, and so who knows? Could be a whole infinite number of possible alternative situational environmental factors that might be causing them to drive slow in the fast lanes. All right, so this is a bias. It's identified in the research. Why do we make it? Why do we tend to make internal attributions while rather systematically overlooking possible situational causes? Why do we do this? Well, the first explanation or partial explanation comes from perception. We can borrow part of what we've learned in the section on sensation and perception. So take a look at this image, and this is one of those ambiguous images. Basically what you're seeing are two possible images. So if you see a vase, then what's in the background? Well, it's the black. If you see two faces looking at each other, well, what's in the background? Well, it's the white. So figuring ground is something that we do as perceivers. We're constantly sorting out what stands out, what's figure, and then what's in the background. So in social situations, particularly if we don't know somebody, what stands out in social situations? If we see an actor acting in a situation that is an actor in the social psychological sense, we're observing people, right? The person that we're observing is the actor. Well, what stands out is the person. They're in the foreground. They stand out because we really know nothing about their background. We can only assume what may be going on in their situation, right? So we have very limited knowledge of their situational factors that might explain their actions. So in perception, in making the fundamental attribution, just ask yourself, in social situations, what stands out? Well, it's the actor that stands out, their social situation, the environment, what's going on for them, just sort of fades into the background. So we're as social perceivers, we're separating out figure from ground. The figure, the actor, is what stands out. So they're most salient, so we attribute the cause of their behavior to them. The just world hypothesis is kind of a point of view. It's a belief that people deserve what they get and get what they deserve. So bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. And it's a bias. And this cartoon kind of captures that. Here's a wealthy couple driving by in their nice car, and they're looking at the homeless guy, and the woman says, "Otis, shout at that man to pull himself together." So if you have ever been in a place where there's people living in the streets, I used to live in Southern California, lots of people living in the streets, you might stop and wonder, why do people end up living like that? Well, if you fall prey to the fundamental attribution bias, then you're going to explain their situation, why they are the way they are in terms of internal attributions, right? So those people are living in the streets because it's something about them. They're lazy, they're unmotivated, they're drug addicts, and so forth. It's something about them. Whereas could be that they just ran into some really bad environmental conditions. I mean, people end up in the streets for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with themselves as persons, as individuals. Situational factors can certainly exert a powerful influence and can land somebody in the streets or uh, uh, put them in economic duress. So the problem with this just world hypothesis, sort of buying in, banking on that belief, really it encourages us to make this fundamental attribution error and can lead us to blame the victim. And this is why a lot of people who are the victims of sexual battery and other sorts of misconduct um, fail to come forward and seek justice because they know what's going to happen. And this routinely happens in cases where somebody has been raped, and then the case enters into the legal realm and it goes to trial. Well, it's really the job of the defense attorney to dismantle the testimony of the victim, the alleged victim, I suppose, to whittle away at their character, to get the jury to blame them, essentially. What were you doing out dressed like that at 2 o'clock in the morning, and so forth, to make to get juries to fall prey to that fundamental attribution bias that say it's something about the person that caused them to be the victim of this awful behavior on behalf of another. So this is a problem with fundamental attribution. It can sometimes lead us to blame the victim. Other reason has to do with, I guess, from an evolutionary standpoint, we can think of ourselves as energy conservers. We want to conserve our physical energy, but we also want to conserve our mental energy. So we're cognitive misers. We don't like to think a whole lot. So an example of this from the research is that, and these are clever studies as well, that is, if you randomly assign individuals to debate, and then you assign their positions, that is, for example, if you wanted somebody to have a political debate and you randomly assign somebody to be the one that argues the side of the far right conservative, and then you randomly assign another person to argue the sort of the other end of the political ideological spectrum, sort of the left wing liberal, and everybody knows that people have been randomly assigned to argue those positions. The observers, the audience members, assume that that's how the person really felt. And I see this with my daughter who's in debate in high school. That is, simply because somebody argues a position that they've been assigned to argue doesn't mean that they actually believe that. But we conflate the two. We confuse the actor with the role that they're playing. So initially, people make that mistake. But however, in these studies that have looked at people's explanations or their attitudes towards the debater, who's argued that assigned position, a week later, they're much more ready to credit the situational constraints. So that perspective, that initial perspective, making that internal attribution can change with time, kind of like what happened in my case with the bullying video. So initially, my response was, those little guys, they're evil. There's something about them, those bullies. After I got some distance from it, I began to consider the environment of the school bus, what's going on there, the group dynamics that occur on those in those kind of situations, and I began to think sort of about the situation, whereas initially I was thinking that it was something about them. So really, we know this to be true. We know that we all have the tendency to make this fundamental attribution error. So it's really incumbent on us, once we know this, to kind of make sure that we're a little bit more caring, a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more thoughtful about people as actors. When we're trying to explain why another person is doing what they're doing, we have to kind of step back and say, yeah, we know that it's some sort of interaction, possibly something about them, something about their situation kind of coming together in complex ways. Some of the associated effects with the fundamental attribution bias that I wanted to touch on are the self-serving bias and the actor-observer bias, or effect. We'll look at both of these. We'll look at the self-serving bias first. So here's a cartoon illustrating this. So this is Calvin and Hobbes. So Calvin whips a snowball at Susie, point blank range, and he misses. How does he explain his missing behavior? I missed it. Darn it, darn it, darn it. Of all the miserable luck. There must have been a cross breeze. I can't believe it. I saved that snowball for 3 whole months. So how is Calvin explaining his actions? He missed. Well, he's making an external attribution, right? It's something about the situations. Because he's such an egoist, he can't say, well, I'm a bad shot. Something about me. He's not explaining his behavior, his missing behavior in terms of some internal trait or attribute, but rather it's a cross breeze, right? So he failed. How does he explain his failure? Well, he makes an external attribution. All right, so this is an illustration of the self-serving bias. So how do we explain our successes and our failures? Right? How do you explain it when you get an A on a test? How do you explain it when you get an F? Well, we want to maintain ourselves in a positive light. So when we succeed, we think, oh, it's something about us. Yeah, I'm particularly bright, or I'm a pretty motivated person, and I study really hard. Right? Something about us when we succeed. When we fail, well, we want to preserve our positive self-image. So we deflect those away, those internal attributions, and we focus more on the situation, right? So it was something about the situation. And I got to admit, as a professor, you see this, that some students, not all, will be more than happy to blame, the professor, the material wasn't presented effectively, I had too much going on. There's all kinds of situational factors that are presented to explain why somebody gets a bad grade. So anyway, this is the self-serving bias. Here's an example of the actor-observer effect. This is the other associated effect. So this is Peanuts. Why are you always so anxious to criticize me, says Linus. And Lucy says, I just have a knack for seeing other people's faults. And then Linus says, well, what about your own faults? And Lucy says, well, I have a knack for overlooking them. So when we are observing ourselves, which we do, and explaining our own behavior, how do we explain our own behavior generally? When we are observing others, what is our tendency when we're trying to come up with a cause and explanation of others' behavior? So there's ourselves as actors, when we perceive ourselves as actors, and then there's us perceiving others, right? This is actors and observers. So the actor-observer effect or bias goes like this. It's a tendency to attribute our own behavior. That is, when we're the actor and observing our own behavior, our tendency is to attribute our own behavior, to explain our own actions mainly in terms of the situation. When we look at other people, that is, when we're the observer, we look at the behavior of others, we attribute their behavior mainly to internal or dispositional causes. This is the actor-observer bias. So here's an example. You bomb a test and you blame the professor. So you've made a situational attribution to explain your behavior of bombing the test. However, your roommate bombs the test and you explain that because of some internal trait that the roommate possesses, that is, they're a procrastinator. So it's similar to the self-serving bias, but it's different. Think of it as sometimes we're actors explaining our own behavior, sometimes we're observers explaining other people's behavior. So when we're explaining our own behavior, the tendency is to make situational attributions. When we're explaining others' behavior, the tendency is toward the fundamental attribution bias. That is, they are the way they are, they're doing what they're doing because of some internal trait or attribute. Why do we do this? Well, it's simply because we are much more in tune and aware of our own situational factors than we are aware of the situational factors of others. That is, we're much more likely to consider the context of our own actions as having some explanatory value than we are to consider the context of others' behavior, because really we know nothing or very little about somebody else's situation. So again, it's kind of what stands out when we're observers. What stands out is the actor, the person that we're viewing. So that person is salient. Their situation, their environmental factors kind of fade into the background. So we make that internal attribution. Whereas for us, our situation looms large. We're aware of our own particular environmental factors, and so we're much more likely to consider the situation when explaining our own behavior. That's the actor-observer bias or effect. All right, so here's a concept check. You tend to attribute the cause of your own behavior differently than an observer one. That is, differently than somebody watching you would. In large part because you have A, less knowledge concerning your own situational factors than observers do, B, less knowledge concerning your own disposition than observers do, C, more knowledge concerning your own situational factors than observers do, D, none of the above. Answer is C. You know much more about your situation than somebody watching you does. All right, so here's the learning objectives. Tend to the red font because you're going to have to go into the text and read about those. Expect quiz and test questions from these learning objectives.